The brown shoebox sat on the top shelf of every closet Sloane Ashford ever had. 7 closets in 18 years. Some of them were small. One of them was just a curtain on a metal rod in the corner of a basement room in a house outside Memphis. One of them was a real walk-in closet in a real 2-story house in a town called Cleveland, Tennessee, where she had lived for almost 3 years with a couple named Garrett, who had been kind to her in the way that some people are kind, which is to say carefully and with a slight nervous distance, the way you are kind to a stray dog. You have decided not to keep. Wherever she went, the box went with her.
Please be
Top
careful.
shelf, pushed all the way to the back. Brown cardboard soft at the corners, the lid held on with a single rubber band that she had replaced exactly twice in 18 years. She had opened it for the first time when she was 6. She had been in her second placement, a foster home in a small town she could no longer remember the name of, run by a woman named Mrs. Polk, who kept 3 foster children at a time and ran the household like a small, efficient business. Sloane had been the youngest. She had been homesick for a home she could not remember, which is the worst kind of homesick there is because there is nothing on the other end of it to go back to. One night she had crawled to the back of the closet in the room that she shared with another girl, and she had pulled the box down off the shelf, and she had sat cross-legged on the carpet with the door closed and looked at the 3 photographs inside. A woman on a porch step holding a baby,
These numbers look strong.
a man at a kitchen table with a coffee mug, the same 2 people standing in front of a small gray house with white trim, the woman's hand on the man's arm, both of them squinting
Wow,
into
it's
the
really
sun.
taking shape.
She had stared at the photographs for almost an hour. She had tried to make the people in them look like people she
Almost
knew.
done here.
She had tried to make the woman's face into a face she could remember the way you try to remember a dream after you have already started forgetting it. Nothing came. The woman in the photograph stayed a stranger. The man at the kitchen table stayed a stranger. Only the house seemed real, and only because a house is a thing you can put your eye on without it asking anything back from you. She put the photographs away. She put the rubber band back on the box. She pushed it to the back of the closet shelf. She crawled out and went to bed and did not cry because she had already learned by the age of 6 that crying in a foster placement was a thing the other children noticed and remembered and used later, and she was not in the business of giving them anything to remember. That had been the first time. The second time had been when she was 9 in her 3rd placement in a house in Knoxville with a couple who had taken in foster children for 15 years and were tired of it and showed her every day in small ways that they were tired of it. She had pulled the box down then and looked at the photographs again, and this time she had unfolded the birth certificate and read the names on it slowly the way she was learning to read in her 3rd grade class, sounding out the syllables. Theodore Lawrence Ashford, Rosalind Lee Ashford, father, mother. The names had felt like words from a book. She had whispered them to herself in the closet that night, the way other children whispered prayers, and she had felt nothing in particular about them because 9-year-old children do not have the equipment yet for the kind of grief that has been waiting 9 years for a place to land. The 3rd time had been when she was 12 in her 5th placement in a small farmhouse outside Jackson, where she had lived with a widow named Mrs. Ardella, who kept chickens and read mystery novels and let Sloane bring books home from the public library by the armful. Mrs. Ardella had been the closest thing to a mother Sloane had ever known up to that point. Mrs. Ardella had also died of a stroke in her own kitchen on a Tuesday morning in October, and Sloane had been moved that same week and the box had gone with her, and that night in a new placement, in a new town, she had pulled the box down for the 3rd time and read the letter from the county probate court that she still did not understand. Property of the deceased, estate pending, no disposition. The words had been bigger than her. She had folded the letter back up and put it away and decided, sitting cross-legged on a strange floor in a strange house, that someday she was going to be old enough and smart enough to understand what those words meant, and that when that day came, she was going to do something about them. The 4th time had been when she was 17, 6 months before she aged out of the system, and that time the box had finally given up its last secret. She had unfolded the deed for the first time. She had read the address on it. She had pulled out an atlas from the high school library the next day and looked up Millbrook, Tennessee, and run her finger along the road that ran east out of Nashville for 60 miles until she found the small black dot with the small black name beside it. A real place, with a real address, with a real building on it that her parents had once owned that had her name attached to it somewhere in a county record nobody had ever bothered to clean up. She had not gone there yet. She had not been ready yet. She had been 17 years old with no car and no money and no plan, and the building had been a thing that existed on a map and not yet a thing she could put her hand on. But she had started getting ready that night. She had started by getting a job. 2 jobs. One at a coffee shop near the high school, one stocking shelves at a grocery store on weekends. She had saved every dollar she did not absolutely need for the bus fare and the cheap notebooks and the library fines she sometimes accumulated because she could not bring herself to return a book before she had read it twice. She had started learning very quietly about probate law. She had read every free legal aid pamphlet she could find at the public library. She had asked the school librarian to help her order books through interlibrary loan that no other 17-year-old in that building had ever asked for. The librarian, a woman in her 50s named Mrs. Hatchett, who had been watching Sloane Ashford for 3 years and had her own private opinions about what a kid like that was capable of, had ordered the books without asking why, and had then quietly slipped Sloane a phone number for a free legal clinic in Nashville on a folded piece of paper one Friday afternoon in May. That phone number had been the start of the trail that ended 5 years later on the front step of a building painted black on the eastern edge of Millbrook, Tennessee, with 12 motorcycles in the lot and a man in a leather vest about to slam a door in her face. But first there were 5 years of work, 5 years of phone calls, 5 years of stamped envelopes, 5 years of forms filled out in blue ink at kitchen tables in apartments she could barely afford. 5 years of making $300 in tips at the coffee shop on a Saturday and immediately turning around and spending it on a 1-hour consultation with whichever attorney would take her. 5 years of being told by polite men in offices that her case was complicated and the records were old and the cost of pursuing it was probably more than the property was worth. And 5 years of nodding politely and paying for the consultation and walking out and not stopping. She had met Delphine Rourke in the spring of the year she turned 20. Delphine had been 62, then almost ready to retire, working out of a small office above a dry cleaner in Nashville with one assistant and a coffee maker that had been broken for 2 years. Sloane had walked in with her brown shoebox under one arm. She had set the box on Delphine's desk and opened it and laid the contents out one by one. The 3 photographs, the birth certificate, the letter from the probate court, the deed. Delphine had looked at the contents of the box for almost 10 minutes without speaking. Then she had looked up at Sloane over the tops of her reading glasses, and she had said the sentence that had changed everything. "Honey, you might actually have a case." The 2 years between that sentence and the morning Sloane finally drove south to Millbrook had been the longest 2 years of her life and also the most useful. She had learned more about Tennessee probate law than most second-year law students. She had learned how to read a county recorder's index. She had learned how to file a public records request and how to appeal one when it was denied. She had learned the names of every clerk in the Millbrook County office by reputation, and she had learned which ones answered their phones and which ones did not. She had built a timeline on graph paper, blue pen for facts, red pen for questions, black pen for the things she could not yet prove but suspected. By the morning, she finally got in her car and drove south. The box was still in the back seat on the floor behind the passenger side, exactly where she could see it in the rearview mirror if she tilted her head a little. The deed was no longer in the box. The deed was folded in the inside pocket of her jacket against her chest, where she could feel it whenever she breathed. She drove out of Nashville at 6 in the morning with the radio off and the windows cracked. She drove past tobacco fields and hay barns and small white churches at country crossroads. And she did not stop for coffee or breakfast, and she did not let herself think about the building she was driving toward, because if she had let herself think about it, she might have had to pull over to the side of the road for a minute, and she had decided some time ago that there was not going to be any pulling over. She came down into the shallow valley where Millbrook sat between 2 low ridges. She passed the water tower with the town name on it. She passed the diner. She passed the hardware store. She passed the gas station with one working pump. She found the address on the first try. 12 motorcycles in the lot, a building painted black every inch of it, a neon sign in the window, music coming through the walls. She parked across the road and sat there for a long time with both hands on the steering wheel. Then she got out and walked across the gravel, and she knocked on the door. The door slammed in her face, not gently, Not the polite kind of slam that says, "Come back later." The real kind. The kind that travels through wood and metal and lands somewhere in your chest like a verdict. Sloane Ashford stood on the cracked concrete step and let the sound settle. Behind her, the parking lot baked in the late Tennessee afternoon. 12 motorcycles sat in a crooked row, chrome dulled by dust leather seats, cooking under a sun that had not let up since noon. The building in front of her had been painted black, every inch of it, even the trim around the windows, even the gutter that ran along the edge of the roof. A neon sign in the front window spelled out the word iron in red and the word saints in white. And somewhere inside, a song was playing low and steady, the kind of song that sounds like it has been playing for a long time and is in no hurry to stop. She raised her hand and knocked again. This time the door opened slower. A bigger man filled the frame. Leather vest arms crossed over a chest the size of a refrigerator. He looked her up and down, once took a long drag off a cigarette and blew the smoke straight at her face. Bars closed. She did not move. "I said, walk away." Her hand was already in her jacket. She pulled out the folded piece of paper she had been carrying for 2 years. The creases in it were soft now worn smooth from being opened and closed and opened again at kitchen tables in apartments she could not really afford, in libraries with bad fluorescent lighting, in the front seat of a 2009 Civic, on the side of an interstate at 3 a.m. when she could not sleep. She handed it to him without a word. He looked at the paper. He looked at her. He looked past her at the empty parking lot like he was checking for something or someone that wasn't there. Then he stepped aside. Sloane Ashford was 22 years old, and she had been waiting for that exact movement for almost half her life. To understand why a young woman would drive 6 hours alone to knock on a door owned by men who did not want her there, you have to understand what she was carrying. Not the paper. The paper was just the proof. You have to understand the box. The box was a shoebox, brown cardboard, the kind that used to hold a pair of women's winter boots. A caseworker had handed it to her on the day she aged out of the foster system, the way caseworkers do, with a tired smile and a clipboard and a pen that didn't quite work. Inside the box was everything that was left of who Sloane Ashford had been before the age of 4. 3 photographs, a birth certificate, a letter from a county probate court written in language she had not understood until she was almost 20, and the deed. The photographs were the part she had memorized. The first showed a woman with dark hair pulled back in a loose braid, sitting on a porch step in late afternoon light, holding a baby on her lap. The woman was looking down at the baby, like the baby was the only thing in the world worth looking at. The second showed a man at a kitchen table with a coffee mug in one hand and a newspaper in the other, smiling at whoever was holding the camera. His hair messy in the way that men's hair gets when they have been awake for a while and have not yet bothered with a mirror. The third showed both of them together, standing in front of a small gray house with white trim, the woman's hand on the man's arm, both of them squinting into the sun. Theodore Ashford, Rosalind Ashford, Theo and Rosalind, her father and her mother. They had died on a wet Thursday night in April of 1998. A semi-truck had crossed the median on a state highway outside Nashville and hit their car straight on. Sloane had been at home with a babysitter. She was 4 years old. She remembered almost nothing about that night and almost nothing about them. A smell, maybe, the texture of a wool sweater, the sound of a man laughing in another room, fragments that could have been real memories or could have been things she invented later just to fill the silence. She had lived with that uncertainty for so long that she had stopped trying to sort it out. But she had the deed. It took her until she was 20 to understand what the deed actually meant. It took her another 2 years to understand that nobody had ever properly closed her parents' estate. She had been a minor when they died. Her court-appointed guardian, a man she remembered mostly as someone who smelled like pipe tobacco and was almost never in his office when she went looking for him, had never filed the right paperwork. The property had sat there in a legal gray area, technically unresolved, for almost 2 decades. She started making calls. She paid $300 she did not have for a consultation with a probate attorney in Nashville, a woman named Delphine Rourke, who wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck and listened to Sloane's whole story without interrupting once. At the end of the consultation, Delphine had set down her pen and looked across the desk and said, "Honey, you might actually have a case." That was the sentence Sloane had been waiting 19 years to hear. She called the county clerk's office in Millbrook, Tennessee, 60 miles southeast of Nashville. She pulled the public records. She started building a timeline on graph paper at her kitchen table, blue pen for facts, red pen for questions. What she found was this. Sometime in 1999, less than a year after her parents died, a motorcycle club called the Iron Saints had moved into the property. Exactly how they had gotten the paperwork done was murky. Someone in the county recorder's office had stamped something they probably should not have stamped. Someone else had not asked the questions someone else should have asked. The Iron Saints had converted the front rooms and the attached garage into a bar. They had been operating in that building under that black paint behind that neon sign ever since. Sloane did her research before she drove down. She knew who the Iron Saints were. They were not a famous club. You would not see their patches on the news, but they were affiliated with clubs that were, and they had a history, and the history was not the kind of history that made you feel safe walking up to their front door alone in the middle of the afternoon. She drove down anyway. She drove down because that house was the only physical thing her parents had ever left her. The only proof that they had existed somewhere, lived somewhere, built something with their hands. She had spent 19 years with nothing but fragments. She was not going to give up the only solid thing without at least looking it in the eye. The drive took her south out of Nashville, then east on a 2-lane highway that ran past tobacco fields and hay barns, and the kind of small white churches that sit alone at country crossroads. Millbrook sat in a shallow valley between two low ridges. A water tower with the town name painted on it, a diner, a hardware store, a gas station with one working pump. The address on the deed was on the eastern edge of town where the buildings thinned out and the road bent toward open country. She found it on the first pass. She did not need the address. She knew it the moment she saw it. 12 motorcycles in the lot, a building painted black, a neon sign, music coming through the walls. She parked across the road and sat there for a long time with both hands on the steering wheel. Then she got out and walked across the gravel and knocked on the door. The first man slammed it. The second man, the one with the cigarette and the arms like rolled steel, looked at her deed and stepped aside. She walked in. The inside of the bar was not what she had expected. It was worn, but it was not wrecked. Tables along the walls. A pool table in the back and with the felt frayed at one corner. A long bar with real wooden stools that had clearly been there longer than most of the men sitting on them. A jukebox in the corner playing something slow with steel guitar in it. The whole place smelled like old wood and cigarette smoke, and the faint, sweet ghost of spilled beer that had soaked into the floor over 20 years and become part of the building itself. A few men looked up when she came in. Then they looked back down at their drinks. They had decided in the half a second it took to register her that whatever she was doing here, it was not their problem yet. The big man at the door, the one who had let her in, walked her to a booth in the back corner. He moved without hurry. He did not introduce himself. Later, she would learn that his name was Cutter, and that he had been with the club for 11 years, and that he almost never spoke unless he had something specific to say. But right now, he was just a wide back in a leather vest leading her through a room full of men who were pretending not to watch her. The booth in the back corner was occupied. A man sat there alone, a glass of water in front of him, a plate of eggs, half eaten, a folded newspaper, an actual paper, newspaper folded in half, the way her father had folded newspapers in the only photograph she had of him. The man was maybe 60, maybe a little older, white hair cut short, heavy in the shoulders in the way that men get when they have spent their lives carrying things. His face was the kind of face that had seen weather. A lot of weather, sun and wind and bad nights and worse mornings. He did not look up right away. He let her stand there for a beat. Then he gestured at the bench across from him. Sit down. Sloane sat. He folded the newspaper slowly and set it aside. He looked at her, then finally, and the look was not hostile. It was something harder to name. It was the look of a man who had been surprised exactly 4 times in his life and was bracing for the 5th. Wendell Halloran, he said. Most people call me preacher. I run this club. He held out a hand. Not a hand that wanted to be shaken. A hand that wanted the deed. She gave it to him. He looked at the paper for a long time, turned it over, looked at the ring. He read the names at the top, Theodore Ashford and Rosalind Ashford, and his face did not change, but something behind his face went very still, in a way Sloane noticed and filed away and did not yet understand. He handed it back. "Where'd you get this?" "My parents owned this building," she said. "They died in 1998. I was 4. The estate was never settled because I was a minor and my guardian never filed the right paperwork. I have been researching the title for 2 years." Preacher picked up his fork, worked at his eggs, set the fork back down without eating. "We've been here 17 years, he said. "We have paperwork too." "I know, I've seen it. There's a gap. Between when my parents died and when your paperwork was filed, the title was unsettled. My attorney says that creates a valid claim." "You have an attorney. I had a consultation." He almost smiled at that. Almost. He looked at her for a long moment across the booth. The jukebox had switched songs. Somewhere behind her, a man laughed at something another man had said. The afternoon light was coming through the front windows in long, slanted bars full of dust. "Let me tell you something straight," Preacher said. His voice was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that does not need to be loud to be heard. "This club has been in this building for 17 years. We are not packing up because a young woman shows up with a piece of paper. I want you to understand that." "I understand it." "But, he set the fork down again. He looked at her differently now, like he was actually looking instead of measuring. "I am also not in the business of having problems I do not need." He paused. "So tell me, what is it you actually want?" She had not expected the question. She had prepared for threats. She had prepared to be thrown out. She had prepared on the long drive down for 100 versions of being told no. She had not prepared to be asked by a 60-year-old man with white hair and a half-eaten plate of eggs what she actually wanted. She thought about it for a second longer than she meant to. "I want to see the house," she said. "My parents' house. Whatever it is now, I want to stand in it." Preacher looked at her. Then he pushed back from the booth, dropped a few bills on the table and stood up. "Come on." She followed him. He walked her through the bar without speaking, past the pool table, past the jukebox, down a short hallway that smelled like old carpet, through a heavy door at the end of the hallway that he had to push hard to open, and then the bar was behind them. They were in a house, an actual house. The kind of house people live in, hardwood floors that creaked under her boots in a way that meant they were original. A staircase with a wooden banister rising up into shadow on the right. A hallway that opened 3 steps into a kitchen, a real kitchen, with cabinets made of real wood worn smooth by years of hands, with a window above the sink that looked out into a backyard. In the backyard, framed by the kitchen window, like a photograph she had never seen, but somehow remembered, were 2 enormous oak trees. The bar had taken over the front rooms and the garage. But the back half of the building, the residential half, the part where her family had actually lived, was still there. Still standing, still shaped like a place where someone had once made breakfast and read books and walked around in socks at night. Sloane stopped in the middle of the kitchen. She did not move for a long time. Preacher stood in the doorway behind her and said nothing. He understood in some way she did not yet have words for that. This was not a moment that needed to be filled with sound. Then she saw the door frame. It was the frame between the kitchen and the small dining alcove. Standard width. Painted white once a long time ago, the paint now chipped and yellowed. And on the inside edge of the frame, running from about 3 feet off the floor up to about 4, was a column of pencil marks. Small, careful, horizontal lines. Each one with a date written next to it in a small, careful hand. Each one with the same initial. S. The highest mark had a full name written next to it. S. Ashford. October 1997. She walked over slowly. She put one hand on the doorframe to steady herself. She read the date again. October 1997. She would have been 3 years old. She would have stood in this exact spot in this exact kitchen while her father knelt down and told her to stand up straight and hold still, and made a small, careful pencil mark on the wood above her head, and then wrote her name in the date next to it. A father she could not remember had measured her in this house and written her name on the wall. She touched the mark with one finger. The wood was soft under her fingertip, worn smooth by 20 years of weather and silence, and men in leather vests walking past it without ever once knowing what it was. She felt something inside her chest shift, not break, shift, the way ground shifts when you have been standing on it for a long time without realizing it was moving. She did not cry. Not yet. That would come later in a motel room 6 miles down the road alone with the television on. Right now, she just stood with her hand against the wall and breathed in slowly through her nose and let herself for the first time in 19 years believe that the people in those 3 photographs in that brown shoebox had been real. Not a story, not a fragment. Real. Real enough to kneel down in a kitchen and measure their 3-year-old daughter against a doorframe and write her name on the wood. She did not know how long she stood there. Long enough for the light through the kitchen window to shift. Long enough for Preacher behind her in the doorway to take one slow breath and let it out. When she finally turned around, her face was dry, but something in her eyes had changed. He saw it. He did not comment on it. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet." His voice had gone quieter than before. She would think about that later, the change in his voice, and wonder when exactly it had happened. Whether it had been the moment she said her name, whether it had been the moment he saw the mark on the doorframe and read the date, whether it had been earlier than that, the moment he turned over the deed and saw 2 names he had not heard spoken in a long, long time. He walked her back through the bar. The men at the tables looked up again as she passed, then back down. The jukebox was still playing. The afternoon was still hot. The world had not noticed that anything had happened. At the front door on the cracked concrete step where she had stood 90 minutes earlier and been told to walk away, Preacher reached into the pocket of his vest and took out a small white card. He handed it to her without ceremony. "Number on the back," he said. "Call me if you want to talk further. Don't call before tomorrow." She took the card. "Drive careful," he said. He went back inside. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded nothing at all like the slam from earlier. Sloane walked across the gravel to her Civic. She got in. She sat behind the wheel for a long minute with her hands in her lap. Then she put both hands on the wheel and noticed they were shaking just slightly, a tremor she had not felt while she was inside. She drove 6 miles down the road to a motel called the Pinecrest, a low cinder block building with a buzzing sign and an ice machine outside the office. She paid cash for a room. The clerk did not look up from his crossword. Room 14, 2 double beds, a television bolted to a dresser, a bathroom with a cracked tile floor. She set her bag down on the bed nearest the door and sat on the edge of it and called Delphine Rourke. Delphine picked up on the second ring. Sloane told her everything. The slammed door, the man in the leather vest, the booth in the back corner, the walk through the heavy door at the end of the hallway, the kitchen, the window over the sink, the 2 oak trees, the mark on the door frame. Delphine listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When Sloane was done, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Sloane," Delphine said, "listen to me carefully. What you just described, the way that man received you, the fact that he walked you back there, at all, that is not nothing. But it does not change the law. The gap in the title history is real. The claim is real. We file the formal challenge. We go through the county process and we let the paper do the work. Are you with me?" "I'm with you, but are you safe tonight?" "I'm safe." "Are you sure?" Sloane looked around the motel room, the locked door, the chain across the latch, the window with the curtain pulled, the buzzing sign outside. "I'm sure." They hung up. She ordered a pizza from a place across the road. She ate 2 slices sitting on the bed with the local news on in the background. Weather, a high school football score, a story about a new stoplight going in on Route 41. The pizza was not very good, but she ate it anyway because she had not eaten since breakfast, and her hands had finally stopped shaking, and she was suddenly completely profoundly hungry. After the pizza, she lay back on the bed without taking off her boots and stared at the ceiling. She thought about the door frame, about the small, careful pencil mark, about a man she could not remember kneeling down on a kitchen floor she had never seen, and writing her name on a wall in a house she had not known still existed. She thought about Preacher, about the way he had set down his fork, about the way his face had not changed when he read the names on the deed, but something behind his face had gone very still, about the quiet in his voice when he said, "Don't thank me yet." She thought about the long drive home she would not be making, not yet. She thought about how, for the first time in as long as she could remember, the ground under her felt solid. Not because anything was settled, nothing was settled. The bar was still a bar. The men in vests were still in it. The legal fight had not even formally started, but she had stood in her parents' kitchen. She had touched the door frame. She had felt the wood under her finger and known that it had been real. That was something she was going to be able to carry with her now, whatever happened next. Whatever happened, she did not bother getting under the covers. She lay on top of the bedspread with her boots still on and her jacket still on and one arm thrown across her face. The television was still murmuring about the weather. The neon sign outside her window was buzzing softly and casting a thin red line of light across the ceiling above her head. She fell asleep thinking about 2 oak trees in a backyard planted by a woman she could not remember in the spring of a year before she was born. What she did not see, what she had no way of seeing, was the man across the road, sitting in a black SUV in the parking lot of a closed feed store, watching her motel room door from 100 yards away. He had been there for almost an hour. He had a phone in his hand and a list of names on the screen of the phone, and her name had been added to the list at 3:45 that afternoon, less than 10 minutes after she walked out of the Iron Saints bar with a small white card in her pocket. The man's name was Sterling Vance, and he had been watching that black building on the eastern edge of Millbrook for almost 6 months. He had a plan for that building. He had a plan for the half-acre of land it sat on. He had a plan for the 2 oak trees in the backyard, although his plan for the oak trees involved a chainsaw and a bulldozer in a Tuesday morning sometime next spring. Sloane Ashford had just walked into the middle of that plan without knowing it. He watched her motel room window go dark. He set his phone down on the passenger seat. He started the SUV and drove away into the warm Tennessee night. Inside room 14 of the Pinecrest Motel, Sloane Ashford slept harder and deeper than she had slept in months. She slept the sleep of someone who has been carrying a weight for a very long time and has finally for one night set it down on a kitchen floor in a house she had been looking for half her life. She did not know yet that the weight was about to come back. She did not know yet that the next morning would change the shape of everything. She did not know yet that the door frame in her parents' kitchen was only the first thing the house was going to give her, and not the last, and not the strangest, and not the one that would finally bring her all the way home. Right now, she just slept, and the 2 oak trees in the backyard, 6 miles away, stood in the dark like they had been standing for 22 years waiting. The phone on the nightstand rang at 6 in the morning. Sloane Ashford opened her eyes to a ceiling she did not recognize, and a thin red line of neon light still cutting across the plaster above her head. For a half second, she did not know where she was. Then the second ring came, and she knew. Motel, Millbrook, room 14, Pinecrest. She picked up. Ms. Ashford. A man's voice. The night clerk. Tired. Careful in the way that people are careful when they are trying not to start a fire. There's a situation with your vehicle in the lot. You'll want to come out and see. She sat up. Her boots were still on. Her jacket was still on. She had not moved an inch in 7 hours. What kind of situation? Just come out, ma'am. She came out. The morning was gray and wet at the edges, the way Tennessee mornings get in early spring. Fog hanging low over the parking lot, the air smelling like cold gravel and diesel from the highway. Her Civic was sitting where she had left it the night before. From a distance, it looked exactly the same. She did not understand what she was looking at until she got within 10 feet of it, and then she understood all at once. 4 flat tires, not flat from pressure loss, slashed. Each one had a clean vertical cut near the sidewall, deliberate, the kind of cut you make slowly with a sharp knife, so that whoever finds it later understands that it was not an accident and was not done in a hurry. The car was sitting on its rims in a low pool of its own collapsed rubber. She stood there in the gray light and looked at it for a long count of 10. Then she turned around and looked at the door of room 14. The door had been kicked in. The frame was split along the latch side, the wood splintered outward, the chain hanging loose. From across the lot, she had not noticed because the door had been pulled mostly closed again, set back into the broken frame to look from a distance like a door that was simply shut. Up close, it was not shut. Up close, it had never been shut. Someone had been inside her room while she slept. Sloane walked back to the door very slowly. She pushed it open with 2 fingers. The room looked exactly the way she had left it. The bedspread rumpled where she had been lying on it. The pizza box on the dresser. Her bag on the bed nearest the door untouched. Her wallet on the nightstand. Nothing taken, nothing turned over, nothing disturbed, except the bathroom mirror. She walked across the carpet and stood in the bathroom doorway and looked at it. 2 words, red marker, block letters, drawn carefully enough that whoever had drawn them had taken their time. Drop it. Sloane stood there in the bathroom doorway for a full minute without moving. Her breath was steady, her hands were steady. Something inside her had gone very cold and very organized in the way that some people get when they are afraid, the way that turns fear into a tool instead of a problem. She took out her phone. She did not call anyone yet. First, she photographed everything. The mirror, the split door frame from inside and outside, the 4 slashed tires from 4 different angles, the empty parking lot in both directions. She took 31 photographs in 8 minutes. Then she walked back into the room, sat down on the edge of the bed, and made 3 calls in the following order. She called the Millbrook Police Department and asked for an officer to come take a report. She called Delphine Rourke in Nashville and told her what had happened. She called a tow truck. She did not call Preacher. Until that moment, until the phone rang at 6 in the morning, this had been a legal dispute. Title claim, probate gap, paperwork. Something that happened in offices and county courthouses and on graph paper at kitchen tables. She had been uncomfortable. She had been uncertain. Uncomfortable and uncertain were things she knew how to manage. She had been managing them since she was 4 years old. This was something else now. Someone had come into the room where she was sleeping and delivered a message. That is a different category of problem entirely. It is not paperwork. It is not uncertainty. It is a hand on your shoulder while you sleep, or close enough to a hand on your shoulder that the difference does not matter. And when a problem changes categories like that in the middle of the night in a motel room, 6 miles down the road from a building you have been looking for half your life, you have exactly 2 choices. You back off, or you move faster. A patrol car pulled into the lot at 6:40. The officer was young, maybe 25, polite, tired. He took the report. He photographed the door and the tires in the mirror. He told her what she already knew, which was that there was not much to work with. No prints, likely, no witnesses, no cameras at the Pinecrest. He told her to keep the room locked tonight if she stayed and to call back if anything else happened. He left at 7:05. Delphine called back at 7:15. Sloane, I'm here. Are you hurt? No. Were you in the room when they came in? Yes. A long silence on the other end of the line. Sloane could hear Delphine breathing slow and deliberate, the way Delphine breathed when she was thinking carefully about how to say the next sentence. Sloane, I'd say, I need to ask you a question, and I need you to answer it honestly. Do you want to walk away from this? Right now, today. I will help you. Nobody would blame you. The house is one thing. Your life is another. Sloane looked at the bathroom mirror with the red letters on it. She thought about the door frame in the kitchen 60 miles away. The pencil mark. The small, careful initial. The date, October 1997. No, she said. We're not walking away. We're moving faster. File the formal challenge today, not next week, today. Another silence. Then quieter, with something in it Sloane had not heard from Delphine before. Something close to respect. All right. Today, Delphine. By 4 o'clock. I'll have it in the county recorder's office before they close. The papers were filed at 3:47 that afternoon. A formal challenge to the title of the property at the address that Sloane had memorized when she was 20 years old, citing the unsettled estate, citing the gap in the transfer history, naming Sloane Ashford as the rightful claimant. By 4:15, it was in the public county records, and anyone who knew where to look could see it. Preacher called her at 6:17 that evening. She picked up on the first ring. Where are you, he said. Still in Millbrook. Different motel. I need to see you in person tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Come to the bar. Come alone. All right. He hung up. She did not sleep much that night. She did not sleep in fear exactly. She slept in a thin, shallow watchfulness, the way she had slept as a kid in the houses where she had not yet learned which footsteps in the hall meant safe and which footsteps meant something else. She had a chair pushed under the doorknob. She had her phone under her pillow. She had her keys in her hand. At 5 in the morning, she got up and made coffee in the little plastic motel coffee maker and sat by the window and watched the sky go from black to gray to the first thin wash of pink along the eastern ridge. At 7:30, she drove the new motel's loaner car to the bar. The lot was almost empty. 2 motorcycles. Preacher was sitting on a wooden bench out front alone in a plain gray shirt with no vest and no colors. He had a ceramic mug in both hands. He nodded when he saw her and pointed to the bench beside him without speaking. She sat. He looked at the road for a long time before he said anything. The road in front of the bar ran east and west and right, then it was empty in both directions. A crow walked across it unhurried. "The thing with your car," he said, "in your room, that was not me. I did not order it. I want you to know that first, and I want you to believe it, because what I'm about to tell you next won't matter if you don't." "All right, it was one of mine. I know who it was. His name doesn't matter to you. He's a newer guy. He thought he was being smart. He thought scaring you off would solve a problem before it became a bigger problem. He was wrong about that on every level it is possible to be wrong about something. He acted alone. He did not ask. He did not tell anyone afterward. I found out about it 3 hours ago." Preacher paused. He took a slow drink from the mug. "He is going to be done with this club by the end of the day. Whatever happens between you and me about this property, you will not have another night like last night. Not from anyone wearing the patch on the back of my vest. You have my word on that." She believed him. She was not sure exactly why, but she did. He set the mug down on the bench between them. "There is something else I need to tell you," he said, "about your father." Sloane went very still. Preacher did not look at her. He looked at the road. "I knew Theodore Ashford, not closely, but I knew him. In 2001, I had a son named Cole who was 20 years old and very stupid in the way that 20-year-old boys can be very stupid. He got himself into a serious situation. The kind of situation that ends with 3 years inside. If everything goes the normal way, it usually goes for boys like him. He was assigned a public defender. The public defender was your father." A pause. The crow had reached the far side of the road and was poking at something in the gravel. Public defenders do not have to do much. That is the truth of that job. The caseloads are brutal. The pay is bad. Most of them are just trying to get to Friday. Your father did not do that. Your father worked my son's case like it was the only case he had. He found things in the file that nobody else would have bothered to look for. He argued things in front of the judge that nobody else would have bothered to argue. He stayed late on a Tuesday night to drive out to the address where the original incident happened alone in his own car to look at a sight line that turned out to matter. My son got a suspended sentence. He did not do 3 years. He came home. He went to community college. He works construction now in Knoxville and has 2 kids and is the kind of father you want your son to be. That is because of Theodore Ashford." Preacher finally turned and looked at her. "When this property came up in 1999, the way it came up with no estate in process, no listing, no name attached, I thought it was clean. I thought the family was gone. I did not know there was a daughter. I want you to understand that I did not know. If I had known, I would have come looking for you. I owe your father that much. I owe you that much, and I am telling you now because it is the truth, and because the truth is something I should have given you the day you walked through that door." Sloane did not say anything for a long time. The crow flew away. "What are you saying to me?" she finally said. "I am saying I am not your enemy in this. I am saying I owe a debt to your father that I cannot pay to him because he is gone, and the only place left to pay it is to you. I do not yet know what shape that takes, but I am telling you what I am, and what I am is not your enemy." He stood up. He picked up the mug. "I will handle the man who came to your motel," he said. "You handle the paper. We will talk again when there is something to talk about." He went back inside. Sloane sat on the bench alone for a long time after he was gone. She did not feel relief exactly. She felt something more complicated than relief. She felt the strange physical weight of a story finally clicking into place. Her father had been a public defender. She had known that from the probate file. She had not known that he had been the kind of public defender who drove out alone on a Tuesday night to look at a sight line. She had not known that 24 years after the fact, in a parking lot in Tennessee, a 60-year-old man with white hair and a ceramic coffee mug would still owe him something for it. The man she could not remember had reached forward in time through a death in a foster system and 19 years of silence and put his hand on her shoulder in the exact moment she needed a hand on her shoulder. She drove back to her motel. She sat down at the small table by the window with her laptop and her notebook and her 3 colors of pen, and she went to work. Here is the part that mattered most about Sloane Ashford, the part the man who slashed her tires had completely failed to understand. She had not spent 2 years researching probate law because she had a lot of free time. She had spent 2 years researching probate law because researching things was the one thing in her life she had always been good at. From the time she was 12 years old, in the 3rd foster placement, she had been the kid in the public library after school, with 5 books on the table and a notebook open beside them. She was good at finding things. She was good at following a thread until it became a rope. She was very good at not stopping until she had the answer. She opened a new document on her laptop and titled it Motel. She started a list. Who knew she was at the Pinecrest? The motel clerk. Delphine, preacher. Cutter by extension, because Cutter had her plate from the parking lot at the bar. Anyone who had been in the bar yesterday afternoon and watched her leave and decided to follow her at a distance. That last category was the largest. That last category was the one she started with. She pulled up the public membership rosters of the Iron Saints from court records, from old news clippings, from a state database of incorporated motorcycle clubs that almost nobody knew existed, but that Delphine had told her about months ago. She made a list of names, 23 names. She started crossing them off. Members over 50 cross out, this was not the work of a careful older man. Members with long records of careful planning cross out, this was the work of someone who thought slashing tires was a clever idea. She was looking for someone newer, someone younger, someone who would have wanted to impress the older men by acting on his own. She found him by 10 that night. Royce Tillman, 26 years old, patched into the club in 2015. 2 priors for petty stuff in his early 20s, both in counties far enough away that the locals would not have heard of them. His name had appeared in exactly 1 newspaper article, a small piece in the Millbrook Sentinel from 6 months ago about a public works meeting where a developer had presented a proposal to rezone a stretch of the eastern edge of town. Royce Tillman had been quoted in that article. 2 sentences, speaking oddly in favor of the rezoning. A patched member of the Iron Saints had publicly supported a rezoning that would have affected, among other parcels, the parcel his own club was sitting on. Sloane sat back from her laptop. She read the article again. Then she read it a 3rd time. The developer named in the article had a name. The name was Sterling Vance. She typed Sterling Vance into the search bar. What came back filled the screen. Sterling Vance Properties, LLC, Vance Development Group. A man in a tailored gray suit at a Chamber of Commerce ribbon cutting. A man in the same gray suit at a county zoning board meeting. A man in the same gray suit standing in front of an architectural rendering of a proposed retail and mixed-use development on the eastern edge of Millbrook, Tennessee. A development whose footprint, when she pulled the proposal from the Public Planning Commission archive at 11:30 that night, sat directly on top of the parcel where the Iron Saints bar currently stood, and on top of the parcel directly to the north of it, and on top of the parcel directly to the south of it. 3 parcels, one of them hers. She kept reading. Sterling Vance had been quietly buying up land on the eastern edge of Millbrook for 2.5 years. He had bought 4 parcels already. He had been blocked on the Iron Saints parcel because the title was a mess, because nobody could figure out who actually owned it, because the gap in the probate process that Sloane had spent 2 years trying to close was the exact same gap that had been preventing Sterling Vance from acquiring the property and finishing his plan. For Sterling Vance, the existence of Sloane Ashford was the worst possible news. If Sloane won the title, she would not sell to him. He had no leverage with her. She had no debts to forgive, no business interests to protect, no reason to take his money. She was a 22-year-old woman who had spent 2 years of her life fighting to get this exact piece of land, and once she had it, she was going to keep it. If the Iron Saints kept the title, Vance had a path. Pressure them. Make their lives expensive and uncomfortable. Convince them through whatever combination of carrot and stick worked to take a check and move on. Bikers can be moved. Bikers had been moved before. A young woman with a probate file and a dead public defender father could not be moved. So the moment Sloane had walked out of the bar yesterday afternoon with that small white card in her pocket, she had become the single largest obstacle to a development project that Sterling Vance had been working on for almost 3 years. And someone somewhere in the chain between Vance's office and the parking lot of the Pinecrest Motel had decided to do something about it. The someone in question was a 26-year-old patch member of the Iron Saints named Royce Tillman, who had 2 sentences in a newspaper article from 6 months ago that placed him on the wrong side of his own club. Royce Tillman was not working for Preacher. Royce Tillman was working for Sterling Vance. Sloane pushed back from the laptop. She walked to the motel window and looked out at the empty lot and the sky over Millbrook turning purple in the late hour. Her hands were not shaking. Her hands had not shaken since the morning. She had crossed some line in herself somewhere between the bathroom mirror and the bench out front of the Iron Saints, and she was on the other side of it now. She did not call Preacher. Not yet. She spent the next 2 days building the file. She pulled every document she could find from the Public Planning Commission archive. She pulled the 4 prior land sales that Vance had completed on the eastern edge of Millbrook and read each closing record carefully. 2 of them had been clean. 2 of them had not. In both of the not clean sales, the seller had reported after the fact in small letters in the back of a county record. Nobody ever read that they had received unsolicited contact during the negotiation period that they characterized as pressure. In one case, a barn fire that the insurance company had ruled suspicious. In the other, a series of late-night phone calls to the seller's elderly mother in Memphis. The pattern was the pattern. The pattern was Sterling Vance's pattern. She pulled Royce Tillman's address from a vehicle registration record that Delphine helped her access through a paid legal database. He lived in a rented trailer 11 miles outside Millbrook on a dirt road. Sloane drove past it once in the middle of the day, slowly without stopping. There was a black SUV in the gravel turnaround beside the trailer. The SUV did not belong to a man who lived in a rented trailer. The SUV belonged, according to the plate she photographed from a quarter-mile away, through a long lens she had borrowed from Delphine, to a corporate fleet leased by Vance Development Group. She had it. On the 3rd morning, with the file printed and bound in a black plastic folder she had bought at the office supply store in town, she drove back to the Iron Saints bar. It was 9 in the morning. The lot had 3 motorcycles in it. Preacher was inside in the same back booth with the same plate of eggs and the same folded newspaper. He looked up when she came in. She walked across the bar without waiting to be brought to the booth. She sat down across from him. She set the black folder on the table between them. "I am not here to ask you for anything," she said. "I am here to tell you what I found because you need to know it, and because the man who came to my motel is one piece of a larger thing, and the larger thing is going to come for both of us if we do not move first." Preacher set down his fork. He looked at the folder. He looked at her face. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She told him about Royce Tillman and the newspaper quote from 6 months ago. She told him about Sterling Vance and the 4 prior parcels, and the 2 sales that had not been clean, and the barn fire and the phone calls to the elderly woman in Memphis. She told him about the rendering on the Planning Commission's archive and the way Vance's development footprint sat directly on top of 3 parcels, including the one they were currently sitting in. She told him about the SUV in the dirt turnaround beside Royce Tillman's trailer and the corporate fleet plate. She did not raise her voice. She did not speed up. She laid the file out on the table between them piece by piece, the way her father had probably once laid out a defense for a sentencing hearing in a Tennessee courtroom in the year 2001. When she was finished, she sat back. Preacher had not touched the folder. He was looking at her. "You did all of this in 3 days," he said. "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want from me?" he said. It was the same question he had asked her on the first afternoon in this same booth with the same plate of eggs between them. But it was a different question now. The first time he had asked it, he had been asking what she wanted from the building. This time he was asking what she wanted from him. Personally, man to woman, across the table. "I want a partnership," she said. "Not a rescue, a partnership. I am going to handle Sterling Vance through legal channels, federal level, tortious interference, witness intimidation. I have the documentation to start the filing this week. I have an attorney who is prepared to walk it into a federal courthouse in Nashville and serve it publicly on a Monday morning. That ends Vance. That part is mine. And from me, you handle Royce Tillman, internally, your way, I do not need to know the details, and I do not want to know the details. I need him out of the club within 48 hours, and I need a written statement from him after he is out, signed and witnessed, describing exactly what Sterling Vance paid him and what Sterling Vance asked him to do and on what dates. That statement goes into my federal filing as an affidavit. Without that statement, my case is strong. With that statement, my case is unbeatable. Preacher looked at her. A small thing happened to his face that was not quite a smile. You are your father's daughter, he said quietly. I would not know, she said. I am told I am going to have to take other people's word for that. He picked up the folder. He opened it. He read the first page. He read the second page. He turned the third page. He read the affidavit she had already drafted in the format Delphine had taught her, with the spaces blank where Royce Tillman's signature would go. He closed the folder. 48 hours, he said. 48 hours. He stood up. He held out his hand across the table. Not for the folder, for her. She stood up and shook it. His hand was the size of a dinner plate and rough across the palm and very warm. He did not crush her hand the way men sometimes crush women's hands when they want to make a point. He shook her hand the way he would have shaken the hand of any man across any table, which was its own kind of point. Go work, he said. I will call you Friday morning. She left the folder on the table. She walked out of the Iron Saints bar into the late morning sunlight and across the gravel to her loaner car and drove the 60 miles back to Nashville with the windows down and the radio off and the air smelling like spring, and she did not stop once on the way. Friday morning at 6:15, Preacher called her. It is done, he said. He signed it last night. Cutter witnessed it. I am sending it to your attorney's email address in the next 10 minutes. You will have it before 7. Thank you. Sloane. It was the first time he had used her name. Yes. What you are about to do to Sterling Vance, do it cleanly. Do it the way your father would have done it. Do not let the part of you that is angry make a single decision in the next 2 weeks. Let the part of you that is patient make all of them. That is how men like him get beaten. Patience and paper, not noise. I know you know. I am telling you anyway because somebody told me the same thing once and I did not listen and it cost me a year of my life. Do not pay that year. I won't. Good. Friday. He hung up. Sloane sat at the kitchen table in her small Nashville apartment with the early light coming in through the window over the sink and her phone face down on the table beside her and the federal complaint already drafted in a document open on her laptop. She read the complaint one more time from the top. She made 3 small edits. She added Royce Tillman's affidavit as Exhibit C. She saved the file. She picked up the phone and called Delphine. It's time, she said. We file Monday morning, federal courthouse in Nashville. I want it walked in. I do not want it mailed. I want Sterling Vance to find out about this lawsuit because a process server in a brown suit hands him a thick envelope in the lobby of his own office building in front of his own assistant on a Monday at 9 in the morning. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Delphine laughed very softly and said, Sloane Ashford, that is exactly what we are going to do. Sloane hung up. She sat at her kitchen table for a long minute and looked at the morning light on the wall. 60 miles southeast of her, in a building painted black on the eastern edge of a small Tennessee town, 2 oak trees were standing in a backyard the way they had been standing for 22 years. A door frame in a kitchen had a small, careful pencil mark on it from October of 1997. A man in a leather vest with white hair and a ceramic coffee mug was sitting on a wooden bench out front, drinking the first cup of the morning, watching the road. And in a corner office in a glass building in downtown Nashville on the 42nd floor, a man named Sterling Vance was about to have the worst Monday of his entire professional life and did not yet know it. Sloane Ashford closed her laptop, put on her jacket, and went out to start the day. Monday morning at 8:57, a process server in a brown suit walked into the lobby of the glass building on Commerce Street in downtown Nashville, rode the elevator to the 42nd floor, identified himself to the receptionist at Vance Development Group, and asked to see Mr. Sterling Vance personally on a matter that could not wait. The receptionist made a phone call. 3 minutes later, a tall man in a tailored gray suit stepped out of an inner office with a coffee in one hand and a phone in the other, and the slightly impatient expression of a man who was not used to being interrupted before 9. The process server handed him a thick brown envelope. "Mr. Vance," he said, "you have been served." Then he turned around and walked out. Sterling Vance stood in the middle of his own reception area, in his own building on his own floor, and held the envelope in two hands and stared at the front of it. Federal court header, his name in capital letters, his company in capital letters underneath, the phrase tortious interference with contract in smaller letters, the phrase witness intimidation in smaller letters still, and down at the bottom in the line that named the plaintiff, two words he had not expected to see on a federal filing ever in his whole life. Sloane Ashford. He did not say anything in the lobby. He turned around very slowly and walked back into his inner office and closed the door behind him with a soft, careful click. Inside the office, he set the envelope on his desk. He set the coffee down beside it. He sat in his chair. He opened the envelope. He read the complaint. He read it twice. By the time he got to Exhibit C, the affidavit signed by Royce Tillman and witnessed by a man identified only as Bartholomew Cutter, his hands were no longer entirely steady. By the time he got to the list of damages and the request for injunctive relief and the line that said the plaintiff intended to subpoena the corporate records of every land transaction Vance Development Group had executed in Millbrook, Tennessee, in the previous 3 years, he understood that the morning was not going to recover. The week was not going to recover. The development was not going to recover. The deal he had been working on for 34 months was over. A 22-year-old woman with a probate file and a federal complaint had ended his career on the eastern edge of Millbrook in 8 pages of double-spaced legal text. He put his head in his hands. The settlement meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 2 in the afternoon at Delphine Rourke's office in a brick building 3 blocks from the federal courthouse. Sloane drove down from her apartment on Wednesday night and slept on Delphine's couch. She did not need much sleep. She had been preparing for Thursday for 3 weeks in the same way that she had prepared for everything else in her life that mattered, which was carefully and on graph paper. Thursday morning, she put on a navy blazer she had bought at a consignment shop for $19, a white shirt, dark jeans, the same boots she had worn the day she walked into the Iron Saints bar. She did not wear makeup. She did not need to look older than she was. She needed to look exactly as old as she was, because part of what was about to happen in that conference room depended on Sterling Vance and his attorneys understanding that the person across the table from them was 22 and entirely alone and entirely unintimidated, and that those 3 things together added up to a problem they did not know how to solve. Delphine drove them to the office at 1:15. The conference room was on the 4th floor, long table, 12 chairs, a window that looked out at a brick wall across an alley. Vance and his team were already there when Sloane and Delphine walked in. 3 of them. Vance in the middle in another tailored gray suit, his hair combed flat against his head, and his face very controlled. To his left, a senior partner from one of the larger firms in Nashville, a man in his late 50s with reading glasses on a chain. To his right, a younger associate with a stack of binders. Sloane and Delphine sat down across from them, 2 against 3, a 22-year-old in a consignment blazer and a 64-year-old probate attorney in a wool cardigan. Behind Sloane in a chair, pushed slightly back from the table, sat one other person, Wendell Halloran. He had driven down that morning from Millbrook in a clean white shirt and dark slacks and a dark jacket. No vest, no colors, no patches on anything. His white hair combed neatly to one side. He had walked into the building beside Sloane and Delphine without a word. He had sat down in the chair behind Sloane, and there he had stayed. He was not going to speak in this meeting. He was not going to negotiate. He was not going to argue a single point. His role in the room was to sit perfectly still in a chair behind Sloane Ashford, in a position where Sterling Vance would have to look directly at him every time he looked across the table, and to be exactly what he was. A 60-year-old man with white hair and a face that had seen weather, who had brought himself voluntarily to a federal civil settlement meeting in support of the plaintiff. That was all he needed to do. He was Sloane's witness, not her shield. The senior partner across the table cleared his throat. "Ms. O'Rourke, Miss Ashford, we are here to discuss a resolution that serves all parties." "No," Sloane said. The senior partners looked up. "Excuse me?" "We are here," Sloane said quietly, "for me to tell you what is going to happen and for your client to agree to it. We are not negotiating. The federal complaint is filed. The affidavit is in evidence. The corporate records subpoena goes out tomorrow morning unless we leave this room with an agreement. There is nothing for us to discuss in the way you mean. There is only the question of whether your client signs my terms today or whether he reads them in the discovery filings next month. She slid a single sheet of paper across the table. The senior partner looked at it. He read it slowly. He passed it to Vance. Vance read it. He read it again. He set it down on the table in front of him very carefully, the way a man sets down a glass that he is no longer sure he wants to pick up again. "This is unreasonable," the senior partner said. "It is not unreasonable," Sloane said. "It is the floor. The ceiling is the lawsuit. Your client gets to choose which one he is standing on by 4 o'clock today." The terms on the single sheet of paper were these. Sterling Vance and Vance Development Group would withdraw from all pending and proposed land acquisitions on the eastern edge of Millbrook, Tennessee, effective immediately and writing on file with the county. Vance Development Group would pay damages to Sloane Ashford in an amount sufficient to fund the full restoration of the property at the contested address, plus 3 years of property taxes, plus legal fees, plus a separate sum acknowledging the cost of the broken motel door and 4 slashed tires and 1 ruined night of sleep. Sterling Vance would personally in writing deliver to Sloane Ashford a statement acknowledging his role in directing the harassment campaign to be sealed in hell by Delphine Rourke and never made public unless Vance violated any term of the settlement, in which case it would be released to a list of 3 Tennessee newspapers Delphine had already drawn up. The federal complaint would be withdrawn with prejudice only after every term was satisfied. The Iron Saints Motorcycle Club as a separate matter would not be named in the settlement at all. Their relationship with the property was Sloane's to handle on her own timeline in her own way. Sterling Vance read the terms a 3rd time. He looked across the table at Sloane. He looked past her just for a second at the part in the white shirt sitting in the chair behind her. Then he looked back at Sloane. "I will sign," he said. His voice was very quiet. "I want it noted that I am signing under protest." "You can note whatever you want," Sloane said. "Sign it by 4. He signed it at 3:27. Sloane and Delphine and Wendell Halloran walked out of the brick building on Union Street at 4:05 into late afternoon sunlight that felt different from the sunlight that had been there when they walked in. The kind of light that lands on your face after a thing you have been carrying for a long time has been set down somewhere it cannot reach you anymore. In the parking lot beside Delphine's car, Wendell stopped. He turned to Sloane. "You did not need me in there," he said. "I know." "Then why did you ask me to come?" "Because my father would have wanted you in the room," she said. "Not for the law, for the witnessing. He spent his whole life standing next to people in rooms like that. I wanted somebody to stand next to me the same way once." Wendell looked at her for a long moment. He nodded once slowly. "All right," he said. He walked to his motorcycle, which was parked at the far end of the lot. He swung one leg over it. He started the engine. He raised one hand to her just briefly, and then he pulled out into the Nashville traffic and was gone. Sloane drove back to Millbrook the next morning. She did not go to the bar. She drove past the bar slowly once and kept going. She drove 3 streets over and parked in front of a small frame house with green shutters and a tidy front walk. She had been carrying the address in her notebook for almost 3 weeks. Wendell had given it to her at the end of the meeting on the bench the morning he told her about her father. He had said only that there was a woman in Millbrook. Millbrook, who had known her parents, who had asked about her once a year for 19 years, and that when the time was right, Sloane should go and ring the doorbell. The time was right. She rang the doorbell. The door opened. A woman stood in the doorway, 65 years old, maybe a little older. Gray hair pulled back into a soft knot at the nape of her neck. She wore a faded denim shirt and a pair of garden gloves still on her hands. She looked at Sloane for a long second, and then she put one hand flat against the doorframe to steady herself. "Oh," she said, "you're Beatrice Whitcomb." "B, just B." Her voice had gone very thin. "And you do not need to tell me who you are. I would have known you in a crowd of 1,000 people. You look exactly like your mother." She stepped aside. Sloane walked in. The kitchen at the back of B. Whitcomb's little house smelled like coffee and yeast bread and the faint herbal smell of a woman who kept a windowsill full of basil and rosemary. B sat Sloane down at the kitchen table and went to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee from a percolator that had been her own mother's. She set one in front of Sloane and sat down across from her and put both her hands flat on the table and said, "I have been waiting 22 years for somebody to knock on my door." She talked for almost 3 hours. She told Sloane who Theodore and Rosalind Ashford had actually been. Not the people in the probate file, not the names on the deed, the living version, the real one. Theo Ashford had been funny, not performatively funny, not the kind of funny that needed an audience naturally funny, the kind of funny that could make a regular Tuesday afternoon feel like something worth being awake for. He had coached a youth soccer team on weekends for kids whose parents could not afford the league fees, and he had been a terrible coach in terms of strategy and a wonderful coach in terms of every other thing that mattered. He had burned everything he ever tried to cook, except scrambled eggs, which for some reason he made perfectly, and he had eaten scrambled eggs for dinner at least once a week for the entire 8 years he had lived in that house. He had yet argued with the neighbors on the south side about a property line for 2 years, and then helped them build a fence on it. He had read the newspaper at the kitchen table every morning, folded in half, and had made small, angry noises at the editorial page that B could hear through the open window across the back fence. Rosalind Ashford had been quieter, a reader. She had stacked books on every flat surface in that house and read most of them twice and then taken the ones she loved most to the public library and donated them with a small handwritten note tucked inside the front cover saying which page had the best sentence in it. She had planted the 2 oak trees in the backyard the spring she found out she was pregnant. B had been there the day she planted them. Rosalind had stood at the kitchen window with her hand on her belly and looked out at the 2 small saplings and said, "I want her to have something that will outlast all of us." B had been in that kitchen the day after Sloane was born. She had brought a casserole and a loaf of bread and a small knitted blanket the color of sunlight, and she had held infant Sloane in her arms at that exact table. The same table where the height chart on the doorframe had its highest mark from October of 1997, and she had told Rosalind that the baby had her exact mouth and her exact eyebrows and was going to grow up to break hearts. Rosalind had laughed and said she did not care about the hearts, she just wanted the baby to be brave. "You are brave," B said quietly across the kitchen table. "I can see it sitting in the chair across from me. You are exactly what she wanted you to be." Sloane did not try to manage any of it. She had spent 22 years keeping careful distance from the weight of not knowing. Now somebody was filling in the picture, and she let it happen, and she did not look away from it, and at one point she put her face in her hands at B. Whitcomb's kitchen table and cried very quietly for a long time, and B just sat across from her and let her cry and did not say a single word to fix it because B. Whitcomb had been a married woman for 39 years and a widow for 6, and she understood that some kinds of grief do not need to be fixed, only witnessed. When Sloane was done crying, B got up and walked to a low shelf in the next room and came back with a small framed photograph she had been keeping since 1996. Theo and Rosalind on the front porch of the house. Rosalind 7 months pregnant. Theo with his hand flat on her belly and his face turned toward her like there was nothing else in the world to look at. The house behind them soft gray with white trim. The 2 oak trees in the background no taller than a man. She gave the photograph to Sloane. "It's yours," she said. "It always was. I was just keeping it for you." The restoration took 8 months. The Iron Saints were gone from the front of the building by February. Wendell kept his word exactly the way Sloane had known he would. The bar fixtures came out first, the long wooden bar dismantled and carted away the stools loaded into the back of a pickup truck. The neon sign came down from the front window in the second week. The pool table went last on a cold gray Wednesday, with 3 of the older members carrying it out by the legs in a kind of small silent ceremony nobody had planned. On the final day, Wendell himself walked through the entire building room by room alone and made sure every piece of the club's 22 years inside that house had been removed. When he was done, he locked the front door, drove to Sloane's apartment in Nashville, and put the key in her hand without speaking. Sloane drove back to Millbrook that same afternoon and walked through the building alone. Every room. She took her time. The hardwood floors were scratched in places, but solid underneath. The staircase banister was still standing, the wood smooth from 20 years of hands. The kitchen still had the original cabinets, real wood worn, but real. The 2 oak trees in the backyard had grown enormous in the time she had been alive. Their roots had pushed up the edge of the back walkway, and she stood looking at the lifted concrete for a long minute and decided she would work around the roots rather than cut them. The restoration was not easy. Nothing about it was easy. There was water damage hidden behind the front walls that nobody had known about until the demolition crew opened things up. There was a structural issue with one of the load-bearing walls in the former bar space. There was a week in January when the heat was out, and she wore her coat inside every day and kept going anyway. The grant from the local historic preservation organization came through in March, smaller than she had hoped, but enough to matter, and Delphine Rourke waived almost all of her remaining fees and called it a graduation present. The contractor was a man Delphine knew, 67 years old, who had been restoring old houses in Tennessee for 40 years, and who took one walk through the building with Sloane and quoted her a price that was fair and then never went a dollar over it. She was at the house almost every weekend. She learned more about old houses than she had ever expected to know. She learned that hardwood floors are more forgiving than they look. She learned that original woodwork is worth saving even when it would be easier to replace it. She learned that 2 oak trees with deep roots are not a problem. They are an anchor. It was in the 5th month of the restoration that she found the safe. The contractor's crew had been opening up the wall in what had once been the back of the bar, which had once been her parents' living room, in order to get at a section of bad wiring. The drywall came down. Behind the drywall, between 2 studs, they found a small steel safe bolted to the floor, hidden by the wall itself, the kind of safe a man might install carefully one weekend and then forget to mention in his will because he thought he had 30 more years to mention it. Theodore Ashford had not had 30 more years. The crew called Sloane. She drove down that same afternoon. The contractor handed her a pair of bolt cutters and stepped back to give her room. It took her 4 tries to cut the lock. Inside the safe were 3 things: a leather-bound notebook with her father's handwriting in it, half full, the last entry dated the week before he died; a bank book in her mother's careful script, the name on the front of it in capital letters reading Sloane Lee Ashford; the deposits inside running from the month after Sloane was born to the month her parents died, 4 years of small, careful entries adding up to a sum that was not enormous but was also not nothing, a sum that her parents had been quietly building for her in case anything ever happened, a sum that had been sitting in a sealed account that nobody had been able to access for 22 years because nobody had known the account existed, and an envelope. The envelope had her name on the front, just her name, Sloane, written in her father's hand. The letter inside had been written 1 week before the accident. She sat down on the bare wood floor of what was going to be her living room and read it. It was not long. It was 3 pages. It said the things a father says to a daughter when he does not know whether he is going to get to say them out loud later. It said that he loved her. It said that her mother loved her. It said that they had been the happiest of their lives the day she was born and every day after. It said that the house they were living in was the first thing they had ever owned together, and that they wanted her to know that every nail in it had been put in place with her in mind. It said that he was a public defender because his own father had been arrested once unjustly when he was a boy, and a young attorney with no money and no time had taken the case anyway and gotten it dismissed, and he had decided sitting in that courtroom at the age of 9 that when he grew up, he was going to be the man who took the cases nobody else wanted to take. It said that he hoped more than anything that she would grow up brave and patient and stubborn, and that she would understand that being stubborn about the right things was the same as being kind. It said that if she was reading the letter, it meant that something had happened and that she should not be afraid because the people who had loved her completely, and love like that does not stop when the people stop. It just goes underground for a while and waits for somebody to come looking for it. The last line of the letter was this: if you are reading this, it means you have found your way home. Welcome back. Sloane sat on the floor of the empty room with the letter in her lap and the bank book beside her, and the leather notebook open beside that, and she did not move for a long time. The light through the front window changed and changed again. The contractor and his crew very quietly finished what they were doing in the other rooms and left her alone, and at some point she heard the front door close softly behind them, and she was the only person in the building. She read the last line of the letter again. You have found your way home. Welcome back. She put the letter down on the floor in front of her very gently, and she pressed both her palms flat against the wood, and for the second time in 22 years, she let herself believe it. The first time had been the doorframe in the kitchen. The second time was now. The morning of the open house was a clear Saturday in late March. The building had been repainted, not black this time, but the soft gray with white trim that had been the original color, the color in the photograph B. Whitcomb had given her, the color the house had been when her mother had stood on the front porch, 7 months pregnant, with Theo's hand on her belly. New boards on the front porch. Window boxes up, not yet planted, the seedlings waiting in Sloane's apartment for next weekend. The 2 oak trees in the backyard with new green just starting to come in along their lower branches. She had invited a small group. Bee was there in her good coat, standing near the steps. Delphine was there, smiling in a way Delphine almost never smiled, her reading glasses on their chain, her wool cardigan replaced for the day with a real spring jacket. The woman from the historic preservation nonprofit was there with a clipboard and a camera and a small bouquet of daffodils she had brought as a housewarming gift. 2 of the neighbors who had remembered the house from before were there, an older couple from across the street who had once eaten Theo Ashford's badly burned pot roast and lived to tell about it. The contractor was there in clean jeans with his wife on his arm. And Wendell Halloran was there. He pulled up on his motorcycle alone, the same motorcycle he had ridden out of the federal courthouse parking lot in Nashville 8 months earlier. He was not wearing his vest. He was not wearing colors. He was wearing a clean gray button-down shirt and dark jeans and a dark jacket, and he was holding a ceramic coffee mug in one hand that he had apparently picked up somewhere down the road, and his white hair was combed neatly to one side, and he looked in the late March sunlight in front of the soft gray house with the white trim like a man who had aged about 3 years in the last 8 months and had earned every one of them. He nodded at her when he saw her standing on the front porch. "You did good work," he said. "You kept your word," she said. He stood at the bottom of the steps and looked up at the building for a long moment. Just stood there and looked at it. He took in the new paint and the new porch boards and the window boxes and the front door, which had been stripped down and refinished and now showed the original walnut underneath. He looked at it the way a man looks at a thing he had been part of in one shape and was now seeing in another shape, and was understanding slowly that the second shape had been the right one all along. "Your father would be proud of you," he said. "I should have tracked you down sooner. When we moved in 1999, I should have looked into it. I should have asked the questions I did not ask. I told myself the title was clean because I wanted it to be clean, and I cost you 19 years of knowing where you came from, and I have to live with that. You did not know." "No, but I should have tried to know." She did not argue with him. He was right, and he knew he was right, and she could see that he knew it, and there was nothing more to say about it. What had happened had happened. What mattered was what came next. "I have something for you," she said. She went inside the house and came back out a moment later with a small wooden box in her hands. She gave it to him on the porch. He looked at her, then at the box, and opened it. Inside the box was a single sheet of paper, a photocopy. It was a page from her father's leather notebook. The page was dated November of 2001, and it was a working page from the case her father had been preparing for the public defender's office, a case involving a 20-year-old defendant named Cole Halloran. The page was a list of arguments her father had been planning to make in front of the judge, written out in his own careful handwriting, some of them crossed out and rewritten in margins, some of them with small notes beside them. At the top of the page, underlined twice, were 3 words: "This boy deserves." Wendell Halloran looked down at the page in the box for a very long time. His shoulders dropped just slightly. His hand on the box was not quite steady. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Sloane reached out and put her hand on his arm very lightly, just for a second. Then she stepped back and let him have the moment by himself. He stayed for the open house another 20 minutes. He talked to Bee Whitcomb for 10 of those minutes, the 2 of them on the front walk in the spring sunlight, 2 people in their 60s who had lived very different lives and had come to the same porch in the same town for the same reason. He shook Delphine Rourke's hand. He nodded to the contractor. He took one walk around the back of the house to look at the 2 oak trees, and he stood under them for a minute by himself with his ceramic coffee mug in his hand and looked up into the branches. Then he came back around to the front, and he found Sloane on the porch, and he put one large, rough hand briefly on her shoulder, the way an uncle might do, the way a father might do, and he said, "I am going to head out now. You take care of this house. You take care of yourself. If you need anything, you have the number." "I have it." He went to his motorcycle. He swung one leg over it. He put the small wooden box carefully into the saddlebag, and he closed the saddlebag, and he started the engine. He raised one hand to her without looking back, and then he pulled out of the gravel and onto the road and away into the bright Tennessee morning. She watched him go until the road was empty. B. Whitcomb came up beside her on the porch. "Ready to go inside?" she asked. Sloane looked at the open front door, at the soft gray paint, at the white trim around the windows, at the house that was a house again. She thought about her parents. Not the fragments this time, not the smell or the half-remembered sound. She thought about the man who had coached soccer on weekends and burned everything except scrambled eggs and called his mother every time his daughter grew another inch, and the woman who had planted trees so her daughter would have something that outlasted all of them, and the public defender who had worked a case like it was the only case he had, even when nobody was watching. She thought about the 22 years she had not had them, about the height chart that had survived somehow through all of it, about B at the kitchen table filling in the picture about Wendell on the bench, with the ceramic coffee mug telling her what her father had done for his son, about the letter in the safe, about the last line, about the words "welcome back." Some things get taken, some things hold on. She had knocked on a door 8 months ago with nothing but a folded deed and a stubborn belief that something was still there to find. She had been threatened. She had been scared. She had stood in a motel parking lot looking at 4 slashed tires and a message on a mirror in red marker, and she had not walked away. Not because she was fearless, because she could not afford to be the kind of person who walks away from the only thing left. And the thing she had found at the end of all of it had been bigger than the building, bigger than the title, bigger than the legal fight and the federal complaint and the man in the gray suit on the 42nd floor. The thing she had found was that the people who had loved her had been real, and that love like that does not stop when the people stop. It goes underground. It waits in a safe behind a wall. It waits in a pencil mark on a door frame. It waits in a 60-year-old man with white hair who owes a debt to a public defender 24 years dead. It waits in the careful hands of a neighbor who held an infant at a kitchen table and never forgot the shape of her mouth. It waits, and it waits, and it waits, and then somebody comes looking for it, and it is right there exactly where it was left. Sloane Ashford turned around on the front porch of the house her father and mother had built. She looked at the open door. She looked at B, who was waiting beside her with her good coat buttoned up to the collar and her eyes a little wet in the spring sunlight. "Yeah," she said. She walked back inside. The first morning Sloane Ashford woke up in her own house, the light came in through the kitchen window over the sink in a way she had never seen before because she had only ever been in the house in the late afternoon in winter, in the gray hours of contractors and permits and decisions about flooring. This was different. This was a Sunday in early April, and the sun was coming in low and clean through the eastern window, and it was lying across the kitchen floor in a long, pale rectangle that ended exactly at the doorframe, between the kitchen and the dining alcove. The doorframe with the pencil marks on it, the doorframe with her own name written on the wood at the height of 3 feet 6 inches in October of 1997. She stood barefoot in the middle of the kitchen in an old t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants and watched the light move slowly across the floor toward the doorframe. She had slept in the back upstairs bedroom, the smaller of the two. It had been her bedroom when she was a baby, according to B. Whitcomb, who had told her this over coffee 3 weeks ago, and had then walked Sloane upstairs and pointed at the exact corner where her crib had once stood. Sloane had bought a single bed and a small dresser and a reading lamp and put them in the room and not done anything else to it yet. She did not want to do anything else to it yet. She wanted to live in it for a while first and let the room tell her what it needed. She made coffee in a small percolator she had bought at an estate sale in Nashville. She poured it into a ceramic mug that had no special history, just a mug she liked. She walked outside through the back door in her bare feet across the small concrete walkway that her mother had once stepped on while pregnant and out into the backyard. The 2 oak trees were enormous in the morning light. She had not really looked at them in the daylight before. Not like this, not when there was nothing else she had to be doing. She walked over to the closer of the 2 and put one hand flat against the trunk. The bark was rough under her palm in the way that very old bark gets ridged and almost warm. The tree was probably 40 feet tall now. The branches went up and out in slow, heavy arcs and lost themselves in their own leaves at the top. Her mother had planted this tree. Her mother had been 24 years old, standing in this exact backyard in the spring of 1994, with one hand on her belly because she was 3 months pregnant and had just told Theo the night before, and she had dug a hole in this exact spot and put a small sapling in it and patted the dirt down around the base and stood back and looked at it and said something about wanting her daughter to have something that would outlast all of them. B had told Sloane the whole story over the kitchen table that afternoon 3 weeks ago, and Sloane had not cried then because she had been done crying for the day, but she cried a little now in the morning light, with her hand on the tree and her coffee cooling in the mug. It was a quiet kind of crying, the kind that does not need a reason because it has had its reason for 22 years. After a while, she walked back inside and refilled the mug. She sat down at the kitchen table, the same table she had eaten pizza at for the first time alone in this house on the day after the contractor handed her the keys sitting on the floor because she had not yet bought any chairs. She had 4 chairs now. She had bought them at an antique store outside Murfreesboro for $90. They did not match each other and they did not match the table, and Sloane did not care about either of those things. The leather notebook her father had left in the safe was sitting in the middle of the table. She had been reading it slowly, 1 or 2 pages at a time, the way you read a book you do not want to finish. There were notes in it about cases, there were grocery lists, there was a long section where Theo had been working out the sentences for what looked like a wedding toast for a friend of his, drafting and crossing out and drafting again, and the toast was about what it means to try to be a good man in a world that does not always reward it. There was a page near the back where he had written in large letters across the whole page, baby girl, Dubo in October, and underneath in smaller letters, God help us, and underneath that in even smaller letters, no, we will be fine. She will be wonderful. Sloane read that page again now in the morning light. She closed the notebook and set it back in the middle of the table. The phone in her pocket buzzed. A text from Delphine Rourke. A simple one. Are you in the house this morning? Sloane wrote back, yes. A minute later, good. Stay there, you earned it. Sloane smiled at the screen and put the phone back in her pocket. The small white card with Wendell Halloran's number on the back was sitting on the kitchen counter beside the percolator, propped up against the wall. She had not called it since the morning of the open house. She did not need to call it. She liked knowing it was there. Wendell had moved on. The Iron Saints had relocated to a new building 20 miles away on a piece of land they had bought legitimately from a willing seller, and the last she had heard from Cutter, who had taken to sending her a one-line text message every couple of weeks, for reasons she did not entirely understand and did not entirely mind, the new place was working out fine. The roof doesn't leak, the most recent text had said. We like it. Cutter. He always signed his name at the end of his texts. She had never told him that she could see his name at the top of the message already. She liked that he signed them. A car door closed out in front. Sloane got up and walked to the front of the house and looked through the window beside the door. B. Whitcomb was standing on the front walk in her good coat, even though it was Sunday morning and a warm day, and there was no reason for the good coat. B. had a small basket in her hands. She saw Sloane in the window and smiled and lifted the basket slightly. Sloane opened the door. I brought you bread, B. said. I baked it last night. It is still warm. Come in, Sloane said. I just made coffee. B came in. She came in the way she had been coming in for the last 6 weeks, which is to say, she came in like a woman who had been coming into this house since 1994 and had simply been waiting for somebody to live in it again. She walked straight back to the kitchen without being shown the way. She set the basket on the table next to the leather notebook. She took a loaf of bread out of it, wrapped in a clean blue dish towel, and set the bread on a wooden cutting board Sloane had bought at the same antique store as the chairs. She poured herself a cup of coffee from the percolator. She sat down across from Sloane at the kitchen table. The morning light had moved by now. It was no longer lying across the floor. It was on the wall now, climbing slowly up toward the ceiling, and it was lighting up the door frame between the kitchen and the dining alcove. And inside that long, warm rectangle of sunlight, the small, careful pencil marks were visible in a way they were not visible at any other time of day. B looked at the door frame, then she looked at Sloane. Your father did that on the first Sunday of every month, she said. Did I tell you that already? You told me he did it every month. First Sunday, always first Sunday. He had a system. Sloane smiled. Your mother, B said, thought it was the most ridiculous thing she had ever heard of. Measuring a baby every 4 weeks. She used to say to me, the baby is not going to grow on a schedule, Theodore. That is not how growth works. And he would say, I know that, Rosalind, but if I do it every 4 weeks, then I have a record. And someday she is going to be a grown woman and she is going to want a record. Bea took a slow sip of her coffee. He was right about that, wasn't he? She said quietly. Sloane looked at the door frame in the long, warm light. Yes, she said, he was right about that. They sat at the table for a long time, the two of them drinking coffee and tearing pieces off the warm loaf of bread and not saying very much. The light kept moving up the wall. Outside the kitchen window, the two oak trees moved very slightly in a wind that was just starting to come up out of the south. Somewhere in the front of the house, a board creaked in the way that old houses creak when they are settling in for a Sunday morning with people in them. Sloane Ashford was 22 years old, and she was sitting in her own kitchen in her own house, drinking coffee with a woman who had held her on her first day alive. And the morning sunlight was lighting up her own name in pencil on the doorframe. Her father had measured her against 24 years ago. She was home. She had found her way home. And the people who had loved her, the ones who had gone underground for a while, were right there exactly where they had left themselves for her waiting.